My name is Sera Whitfield. I'm 31 years old, and until about 4 months ago, I genuinely believed that if I just kept giving, kept showing up, kept being useful, my family would eventually look at me the way they looked at my brother. I know how that sounds. I'm a project manager at a mid sized logistics firm in Columbus, Ohio. I have a master's degree in operations management from Ohio State, which I paid for almost entirely through a combination of a partial merit scholarship, weekend consulting gigs, and one very humbling year of adjunct tutoring that paid $12 an hour. I am, by any reasonable measure, a functioning adult who should have figured this out sooner. But there's something about the family you grew up in, something that bypasses every rational part of you and goes straight to the 7-year old who just wants her dad to look up from the television when she walks into the room. The dinner was supposed to be a celebration. That's the part I keep coming back to. Have you ever had something happen to you that was so perfectly designed to wound you in exactly the right place at exactly the right time that you almost had to admire the precision of it? That's what that night was. My promotion dinner. The one I planned myself. Because I'd learned a long time ago that if I waited for someone else to celebrate me, I'd be waiting forever. I'd just been promoted to Director of Operations at my company. It wasn't a small thing. I was the youngest director in the company's history, managing a team of 22 people across 3 distribution centers. My boss, a straightforward man named Gerald, who did not give compliments easily, had pulled me aside after the announcement and said, quietly, that he hadn't seen someone move through the ranks like that in 15 years. I held it together until I got to the parking garage. Then I sat in my car and let myself cry for about 4 minutes, which is exactly as long as I allowed myself, because I had a status meeting at 2. I'd booked a private room at a restaurant downtown, Riverstone, the kind of place with cloth napkins and a sommelier who doesn't make you feel bad for asking what the difference is between 2 wines. I invited 8 people: my closest work friends, my college roommate, Teresa, and my parents. I should have known something was off when they arrived 20 minutes late without texting. My dad walked in first, straightening his jacket like he'd just come from somewhere more important. My mom followed, looking around the room the way people do when they're mentally comparing it to something. They hugged me briefly. No card, no flowers. I told myself it didn't matter. The evening started warmly enough. Gerald gave a small toast. He talked about the restructuring project I'd led last spring, the one that had saved the company an estimated $2.3 million in distribution inefficiencies. He used the phrase quietly exceptional, which I've thought about many times since then. My colleagues raised their glasses. Teresa caught my eye across the table and mouthed, "I told you so," which made me laugh for real. I looked at my parents. My mom was smiling, but it was the smile she used for other people's children: polite, performative, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes because the eyes are already somewhere else. My dad leaned over to her and said something. She nodded. I turned back to Gerald and thanked him. Then, about 40 minutes in, the table had shifted into that loose, comfortable rhythm of a dinner going well. People were refilling glasses. Someone had ordered the burrata and passed it around. The conversation had split into 2 or 3 smaller ones, the way it does when everyone is actually relaxed. That's when my mom decided to bring up my brother. It started innocuously. Someone asked if I had siblings, and before I could answer, my mom said, "Yes, her brother Cold. He's in law school at Georgetown." She said it the way you say a fact you've been waiting to introduce, like a card you've been holding. "Second year," my dad added, nodding. "Top of his class." The person who'd asked, one of my colleagues, smiled politely and said, "That's great. Big family of achievers." My mom laughed a little. "Well, Colt, he's always been the one who knew exactly what he wanted. Very driven. He's going to do something real with his life." She paused, then glanced at me with that smile. "Operations management is steady work, of course." Steady work. I heard Gerald go quiet. I heard the burrata plate stop moving. I kept my expression neutral, which is something I've had years of practice doing. My dad picked up the thread the way he always did, the two of them like a relay team that had been running the same race for 30 years. Cole's got that fire, the kind of ambition that changes things. Lawyers make a real mark on the world. No offense to logistics. He smiled around the table, an invitation for everyone to agree with him. Nobody agreed with him, but nobody pushed back either. And I felt it then, that old familiar thing. The invisible chair being pulled out from under me at the one table I'd sit myself. I should have let it go. I've let it go 100 times before. But there was something about the fact that I was sitting in a room full of people who respected me, people who had seen me work, who knew what I was actually capable of, that made the usual silence feel impossible. I set down my glass. I want to ask you something, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. Both of you. My dad looked up. Do you know what this promotion actually means? Not in general terms. Specifically. My mom opened her mouth, but I kept going. I managed 22 people across 3 states. I led a project last year that saved this company over $2 million. I finished my master's while working full time and paying you back the loan you gave me for my undergrad every month on time for 6 years. I paused. And you just described what I do as steady work in front of my colleagues. At my promotion dinner, the table had gone completely still. My dad's expression shifted. He didn't like being called out. He never had. There was a particular tension that came into his jaw when he felt challenged, and I had known that tension my whole life. We're proud of both of you, he said in a tone that suggested the conversation should end there. You're proud of Colt, I said. You've been proud of Colt since he was 12 years old and decided he wanted to be a lawyer. I've been watching you be proud of Colt for 19 years. That's not fair, my mom said, and her voice had an edge to it now. You came to one of my graduations, I said. One. My high school graduation. You skipped my college graduation because Colt had a debate tournament. You didn't come to my grad school hooding ceremony because you said it was too far to drive. Columbus to Cleveland is 2 hours and 40 minutes. My dad pushed back slightly from the table. I don't think this is the place. You told me, I said. And here is where my voice finally broke, just slightly, not from sadness, but from something harder than sadness. You told me last Thanksgiving, when I said I was up for this promotion, that I shouldn't get my hopes up because I didn't have the kind of personality that rises to the top. Those were your words. You said Colt had that quality. That's something that makes people follow you. You said I was more of a support role. My mom looked at her plate. And then 2 weeks later, I got the promotion. And you've said nothing about it. Not one call, not a text. I had to invite you here myself. And you showed up 20 minutes late and spent the first hour finding ways to redirect every compliment about me into a conversation about my brother. The silence had a texture to it now. My dad looked at me across the table, and when he spoke, his voice was low and controlled in the way that meant he was furious. You want to do this here? In front of your co-workers? You want to make a scene at your own party? I looked at him for a long moment. I'm not making a scene, I said. I'm just finally saying true things out loud. I folded my napkin, set it beside my plate, and stood up. I'm going to give you a minute, I said to the table at large, and I meant it as a kindness, a way to let the air back in. I excused myself, walked through the main dining room, pushed through the heavy glass door and stood on the sidewalk outside. It was October, cold, the kind that gets into your collar. The street was busy with Friday night traffic, and I stood there on the edge of the curb, breathing, watching the lights change from green to yellow to red. I didn't cry. I was surprised by that. I'd always cried easily, In private, the kind of crying you do when you finally let yourself feel what you've been holding at arm's length. But standing on that sidewalk, I just felt hollow and clear. Like a jar someone had rinsed out. Teresa found me about 3 minutes later. She didn't say anything for a moment. She just stood next to me. How much of that have you been carrying? She asked. A while, I said. She nodded. You good? I think so. Okay, Gerald wants to know if you're coming back in. I went back in. My parents had gone. The dinner continued. It was a little quieter, a little more careful, but people were kind in the way that people are when they've witnessed something private and choose to honor it by not making it the subject of the rest of the evening. Gerald poured more wine. Someone ordered dessert. Teresa made a joke that I don't even remember now, but I laughed and the laugh was real. I drove home alone. My apartment is on the third floor of a building near Goodale Park, the kind of neighborhood that smells like coffee in the morning and sounds like someone's always walking a dog. I moved there about 18 months ago after leaving a place I'd shared with an ex, and I'd spent that first year making it actually feel like mine. A good couch, plants that I kept alive. A bookshelf I'd built myself from a kit on a Sunday afternoon, slightly crooked but standing. I poured a glass of water, sat on the couch, and looked at my phone. 14 missed calls, 7 from my mom, 7 from my dad. No voicemails, just the calls stacked up like accusations. I put the phone face down and went to bed. The message came the next morning. My mom texting, "You humiliated us in front of strangers. I hope you feel good about yourself. Your father can barely speak. He's so upset." I read it twice, then I set the phone on the kitchen counter and made coffee. Here is what I want to tell you about the weeks that followed, because I think this is the part that people don't talk about enough. Cutting ties, or even just stepping back from family, is not a single clean moment. It's not the dinner. The dinner was just the thing that broke the surface. Everything underneath had been there for years, and the weeks after were about finally looking at it directly. I was the first person in my family to get a graduate degree. Not just in my immediate family, in the extended family too. My parents had both gone to state school, my dad for 2 years before dropping out, my mom finishing a degree in education that she'd never used professionally. They weren't incurious people. They weren't unkind people exactly, but somewhere along the way, they decided that what they understood was real and what they didn't was suspect. My dad had worked in insurance for 30 years. Stability was the highest value. When I'd come home in ninth grade, excited about a national essay competition I'd placed third in, he'd said, "That's nice. Does it help you get a job?" It wasn't malicious. That's what I had to keep reminding myself. It was just a completely different set of values, and I had grown up inside that system, internalizing its logic, trying to translate my achievements into a language they would recognize. The trouble was, the language they recognized was Cole's language. Georgetown law, bar exam, courtroom. Those were things they understood the weight of. Operations management was in their mental map, something anyone could do with a little common sense and a good attitude. The fact that it required years of study, technical skill, and a specific kind of systems thinking that not everyone has, this had never quite penetrated. And I had spent years trying to explain it to them. I caught Teresa about a week after the dinner. We were on the phone for 2 hours, which is unusual for both of us, neither of us being particularly phone people. What I keep thinking about, I told her, is how I still felt guilty. Even after everything, I woke up the morning after and my first thought was that I owed them an apology. "But you didn't apologize," she said. "No, but I thought about it." "That's the conditioning," she said simply, not unkindly. "That's just what it looks like when you've been in that pattern your whole life." Teresa grew up in a version of the same thing. Different details, same architecture. She'd spent her 20s in therapy working through it, which is why she could name it so quickly. I'd spent my 20s being very productive and not thinking about it at all, which is she pointed out, also a coping strategy, just a less sustainable one. I started seeing a therapist in November. Her name is Dr. Okafo, and she has an office near Clintonville with two plants in the window that she clearly tends carefully. And she never makes me feel bad for how long it took me to start talking about any of this. She told me something in our third session that I've thought about almost every day since. She said, "The love you were looking for was real. The fact that they couldn't give it doesn't make the need wrong. It just means you were looking in the wrong place." I sat with that for a long time. I didn't answer my parents' calls for 3 weeks. Then my mom sent a longer text, and this one was different. It said, "Your brother's tuition bill came, and there's a shortfall. He's got financial aid, but there's still 12,000 left. We told him you might be able to help." I put the phone down, picked it up again, read it a second time. They had, without asking me, without any conversation, told my brother that I would help cover his law school tuition, $12,000. After the dinner, after not calling to apologize or acknowledge what had happened, they had simply moved on to the next transaction. I called my mum back. She answered on the second ring. "I got your text," I said. "Oh, good. So you understand. If you could send it this month, that would." "I'm not sending it." Silence. "Sera, I need you to hear me," I said, and I was very calm, which surprised me. "I have covered things for this family for a long time. I paid back the undergrad loan with interest. I sent money when dad's car broke down. I paid for half of your kitchen renovation because you said you couldn't afford it, and then 2 months later, you took a cruise. I have never once been asked. I've been told. And then I'm expected to feel grateful for the opportunity to help." "We're family," she said. "That's what family does." Family also shows up for each other. Family comes to graduations. Family doesn't tell their daughter in front of her colleagues that what she spent her career building amounts to steady work. My mom was quiet for a moment. "Your father and I have given you a lot over the years." "I know what you've given me," I said. "I know exactly because I kept track. And I gave it all back with interest, and then I kept giving. And I am allowed to stop." "If you do this," she said, and her voice went cold in a way that I recognized. The temperature drop that always preceded the ultimatum. "If you refuse to help your brother when he needs you, that says something about who you are." I almost laughed. "Yeah," I said, "I think it probably does." I hung up. My hands were shaking, but just slightly. I went to my kitchen, filled a glass of water, drank the whole thing standing at the sink. Then I sat down at my laptop and sent an email, not to my parents, to my brother directly. I told him I was sorry he was in a difficult situation, and I meant it. I told him I wasn't in a position to contribute, and that was true too, though position was doing some complicated work in that sentence. I told him I hoped he'd find a path through it, and I genuinely hoped that, because Colt was not a bad person. He was just the one they'd chosen, which was not entirely his fault. He wrote back 3 days later. "Okay. Good luck with everything." That was it. I didn't know whether to be hurt or relieved, and eventually I decided it was both. The quiet that followed was the strangest thing I'd ever lived through. I'm used to noise. I'm used to managing things, troubleshooting, being responsive. The silence from my parents, because they did go silent after that call, felt like a test at first. Like they were waiting to see if I'd break. And then slowly over weeks, it stopped feeling like a test and started feeling like weather. Just something that was happening. Not to me specifically, just the new conditions of the world I was moving through. Work helped. It always helps me, which is both a strength and something Dr. Okafor and I discuss regularly. The director role had genuinely changed things. I was in different rooms now, invited into decisions I'd previously only heard about secondhand. I ran a cross functional meeting in January with people 3 levels above me and walked out thinking, with some surprise, I was the best person in that room for this specific problem. Not the most important person, not the most senior, but the most equipped. That was new. Believing it, I mean, not just performing the belief. Teresa came over one Saturday with a bottle of wine and her very specific opinions about my bookshelf, which she had been waiting to share for some time. We drank too much and stayed up too late, and I talked about my parents more honestly than I had with most people, because most people who knew my family had also absorbed the family's version of events, which put me in the supporting role. Teresa had only ever known my version. You keep waiting for them to realize something, she said at some point around midnight. I know. And I'm not saying they won't. But what if they don't? What does your life look like if they just don't? I thought about it for a while. Probably pretty similar to this, I said finally, looking around at my apartment. The slightly crooked bookshelf, the plants on the windowsill, the wine on the coffee table, which I think is the part that scares me. Why does that scare you? Because if this is enough, I said, then it means it was always enough, and I just spent a long time letting them convince me it wasn't. Teresa looked at me for a moment. Then she refilled both our glasses without saying anything, which was exactly the right response. Spring came. My parents sent one email in February. Not an apology, an update. My mom wrote about her book club, her garden, my dad's golf league. Colt had taken out additional loans and was back on track. At the bottom, almost as a postscript, we hope you're doing well. We miss you. I read it 3 times trying to locate the apology. There wasn't one. I wrote back 2 weeks later. Short. I said I was well. I said I was glad Court had sorted out his tuition. I said I needed time and space and that I would reach out when I was ready. I hit send and then I closed the laptop and went for a run along the river, which is something I'd started doing that winter, badly at first and then less badly. It was a Tuesday evening in late March and the light was doing that particular thing it does in early spring, gold and sideways, making everything look slightly more significant than it is. I ran for 40 minutes and thought about almost nothing. When I got home, I showered, made dinner, and called Teresa to tell her about the email. What did it feel like? She asked. Sending it? Like setting something down, I said. Something I'd been carrying for a long time. Not dropping it, just setting it down on purpose. There's a version of the story where I wrap everything up cleanly, where I have a transformative conversation with my parents. We all cry, we understand each other, and the family becomes something different. I used to want that version. I would have traded a lot for it. But that is not my story, at least not yet, and I have made a kind of peace with the not yet that feels more honest than hope ever did when I was forcing it. What I have instead is this: an apartment that feels like mine, a job I'm good at and know it, a therapist who helps me understand the machinery of my own thinking, a friend who shows up with wine and real opinions, and a version of myself who no longer needs to translate her achievements into a language her parents find impressive. My brother sent me a message last month, nothing heavy, just a meme, the kind he used to send in our group chat before everything went quiet. I laughed at it. I sent one back. We haven't spoken on the phone. We haven't addressed any of it directly. But something small moved, and I lit it. I don't know what my family becomes from here. I genuinely don't know. But I know that I walked out of that dinner and did not collapse. I know that I said true things out loud in front of people I respected and the sky did not fall. I know that when the request for money came, I said no and meant it, and the guilt that followed was real but survivable. And I know this. Whatever my parents believe about my brother's fire, his ambition, his mark on the world, I have made mine. Quietly, steadily, without their permission or their applause. It turns out steady work was never the insult they meant it to be. I keep thinking about the moment I set my napkin down. Not the words I said after. Not the drive home. not the 14 missed calls stacked on my phone like a verdict. Just that one small movement. The fold, the placement, the deliberate quiet of it. Because I think that's where it actually happened, not in the speaking, but in the deciding. There's a version of me that would have swallowed it. I'd done it so many times before. Smiled through the comparison, redirected the conversation, apologized later for making things uncomfortable. That version of me had kept the peace for 31 years, and the peace had cost her everything she never got to want out loud. What I understand now, looking back at that dinner table, is that what my father said wasn't really about operations management or law school or who had more fire. It was about a story he'd written a long time ago. One where Colt was the protagonist, and I was the dependable supporting character who kept everything running so the real story could happen. He believed that story. I think he still does. And for most of my life, I believed it too, which is the part that's hardest to sit with. The cause was never the dinner. The dinner was just where the effect finally showed up. Years of small erasures accumulate. A missed graduation becomes a pattern. A dismissive laugh at the wrong moment becomes a belief you carry into job interviews and relationships and conversations where you're already pre apologizing for taking up too much room. You don't notice it happening because each individual moment seems manageable. It's only when you're standing on a cold sidewalk in October, breathing, that you realize how much weight you've been holding and how long you've been pretending it wasn't heavy. What I've had to learn, and I mean really learn, not just understand intellectually, is that integrity doesn't announce itself. It accumulates quietly the same way the damage did. Every time I chose honesty over performance, every time I did the work without waiting for someone to validate that it mattered, every time I paid back what I owed and refused to take what I hadn't earned, those weren't dramatic moments. They were just ordinary choices that turned out to have a direction. Intelligence, I think, is less about how fast you understand things and more about what you're willing to look at directly. I spent a long time being very smart about every problem except the one sitting at my own dinner table. Dr. Okafor didn't tell me anything I didn't already know somewhere. She just held the space steady long enough for me to stop flinching from it. And then there's the thing nobody talks about when they talk about resilience, the part that happens after the dramatic moment, after the door closes and the silence starts. Resilience isn't the speech at the table. It's the Tuesday morning 3 weeks later when you still don't answer the phone and the guilt is real and you make coffee anyway. It's choosing, again, the version of yourself you decided to become when nothing in the moment is making that choice feel particularly heroic. My father called what I do steady work. He meant it as a ceiling. I've decided to take it as a foundation. That's the difference, I think, between a story that breaks you and one that builds you. Not what happens, but what you decide it means.